Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Pete Burden, and I'm your host today on the Healthy Power Alliance podcast. We're using this space to explore what it means to be powerful together, to look at how human power, particularly as it appears in organizations and communities, can benefit other humans and the planet we all depend upon. We're speaking with people who are in the middle of doing that, people who think they know how to do it, and people who are doing academic studies in that area as well, of what works and probably what doesn't too. And we love the theory, we're interested in that, but really we're interested in practice, in behavior, what people actually do. So with that said, as a little introduction, let me introduce our current guest, who's Paul Dickinson. Now, Paul, I think I've known you since probably 2000s or something like that.
Long time, yeah, long
A
time.
long time. Thank you for coming, by the way. It's really great to have you here. And when we were at that time, I think you were very much involved in CDP and the Carbon Disclosure Project, and I'll get you to say a little bit more about that. But essentially, it's to do with kind of carbon reporting, and I think a real kind of groundbreaker in that area. And in fact, you founded that, as far as I understand it,
About 25 years ago, and I'd say it's an exercise in administrative power of a certain kind.
Great. Okay. Well, let's talk some more about that. But you've got other things you've been doing since then. So you've been running a podcast called Outrage and Optimism for a number of years, very successfully. Um, and you've also taken on, I guess this comes out, you're a founder and then you transition into being a chair or an advisor or something like that. And then you start something else. So you've got a number of other things on the way. And the theme seems to be all to do with climate change and kind of climate justice, perhaps, but also at a kind of economic and a policy level, trying to link up government and business, a big focus on business. I remember you wrote a book on business years back as well. I remember coming
Called
across that.
Beautiful Corporations, kind of in
That's
the.
that was way ahead of its time when you did that. That was very
I
good.
mean, you can ask how beautiful they are, but it's a provocation, perhaps.
No, it was great, and as I say, ahead of its time. I mean, when would that have been? Late.
That came out in 2000, published by Financial Times, Prentice Hall, the publisher. But I was kind of reasonably proud of it. It actually summarized about 10 years I'd done in corporate design and marketing, and my theme was sustainability product marketing. But that also might have been ahead of its time, or might not have been the right way of looking at it. But it was a nice piece of punctuation in my career.
Yeah, very good. So tell us a little bit more about your career then. What else, other bits that I've missed or got wrong?
I think the absolute defining characteristic of my career is something that happened a long time ago. So I sort of left school early. I wasn't good at school at all, and actually got some interesting training in my teens. But at the age of 20, I decided I wanted to be a politician. So I thought, how did you become? I actually studied politics. So I did my A levels, as they were called, and I went to the University of Sussex at the age of 24 as a sort of younger, mature student to study politics. But the thing I want to draw your attention to is that I left in the middle of my first term. And I didn't leave because I wasn't enjoying it, because I was enjoying it a lot, actually. And I subsequently moved to Brighton. And so I clearly enjoyed the town. And I enjoyed Sussex University and I enjoyed the curriculum. So the question is, why did I leave in the middle of my first term? And the reason is because I was working in an annual report design company. And I had been for about a year, looking at the annual reports of the world's largest corporations. And so in 1988, I took a view that actually the power of national governments was declining and the power of corporations was increasing. And therefore, it would be more logical for me to pursue a political career through the business system than through the national government system.
Mm-hmm.
And, I then went on various circuitous routes. But I think on balance, that was a good decision. What was probably the second transformative thing for me, I mean, I did a bit of NGO work, helped set up a Stonewall Lobby group way back then, learned so much from many brilliant campaigners. But the last thing I'd say before setting up CDP was I did a master's degree in responsibility and business practice at the University of Bath. And that was set up in partnership with something called the New Academy of Business, which was set up by Anita Roddick. And she was very brilliant, visionary, kind of person who in essence understood the comprehension of big business and its potential role in society. And she gave a speech in 1987, actually, which I've got transcribed, which if it was delivered today by any business guru, you'd think was, so 2025, and she delivered it in 87,
Yeah.
So that's the big story. And in that master's degree, I met a scientist who'd been working with James Lovelock on Gaia theory. And I was sort of introduced to climate change. And then I had a bit of a bit of time off, I would say, perhaps in 1999. And looking and starting to research into climate change, I concluded I would spend the rest of my life working on climate change, and then subsequently with others founded this NGO CDP in 2001.
Right, lovely. And tell us a little bit about CDP while we're on it.
Yeah, so it's been described as the most powerful NGO you've never heard of, and essentially it has been doing almost the similar thing for now 22 annual cycles, and that is getting the world's largest companies to report initially to their shareholders, but subsequently also to their customers through a reporting platform. What's unusual about it is we started it as a global organization. So we started by going to companies, the biggest companies in the world, wherever they were located. And we've continued to grow as a global organization. So CDP is now has something like 24,000 of the world's largest companies reporting through it, maybe 60% of the global economy, also 1,000 cities with offices, in the major capital markets. It's about 600 people, $100 million turnover. It's a charity, but it has probably 60% of its income is commercial. And just the data that comes in to the CDP databases then goes out to things like the Bloomberg network and to companies like MSCI and Standard and Poor's. I mean, there's lots more to say about CDP, but I think that the crucial thing is within the context of this podcast. I have said before that kind of CDP has a lot of influence over corporations, but it has influence with their consent. And corporations actually do want to do the right thing, or shall we say, the contested forces within corporations want to do the right thing, and I think CDP gives them an opportunity to do that. And then just the last thing I want to mention about CDP, because I've talked for 10 hours about CDP or 10 days if you want, but I've been really struck by the degree to which politicians have been very supportive of it. Our first launch event, when we were a 3-person organization, had Madeleine Albright in New York, the UK Prime Minister Tony Blair wrote us a letter of support. And then subsequently, we've had people like Bill Clinton speak at our launch events. The Secretary General of the United Nations has written an introduction to our reports. At our recent launches in Europe, Ursula von der Leyen has spoken, Chancellor Angela Merkel, the last 2 prime ministers of Japan. So although we're a not-for-profit organization sort of working on something quite geeky, carbon accounting and carbon strategy of big companies, major politicians have been very supportive of what we do.
Fantastic. And I really want to get into this a little bit more, and particularly what you've done inside those environments, how it worked when you started and so forth. But I just want to go back a little bit first, if we can, and contextualize things. So, and one of the things that's maybe important to say is to talk about the word power. So we're using this power, power is a very contested word in kind of academia. There's all sorts of ways of thinking about it. But we're using a very simple definition, which is the ability to accomplish goals. So we're just starting with that. And then healthy power, which is the term we're using, is the ability to accomplish your goals or get your needs met, but doing that in a way which actually grows other people's power at the same time. That's where we're coming from. So I'm interested, first of all, to start maybe with how you understand power. And maybe to do that, we could go back to when you first encountered power, even before your early days at university, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I will answer in a slightly, kind of work-related technical sphere.
Sure.
And I was working in a graphic design company. And there were some very interesting things about that company. It was called Wolf Olins. I mean, it still goes in different guise, decades later. The company name said Wolf Olins, and then underneath it said corporate identity. And I mean, at one level, people would say, well, this is just designing logos and things like that, and guidelines for how to use your logo. And at one level, that is what it is. But the founder of the company, one of them, I never met Michael Wolff, but Wally Olins, was fancied himself as quite a deep thinker about corporations and their role in the world. And so it was a beautiful environment, actually. I was in beautiful offices, and I was being paid quite well, and I was having lovely food that was kind of laid on for me. I was trusted. There's a very important point here. I was a freelancer, and I remember this huge building with in the middle of London. And I was working on some amazing online thing called the Reuters text line machine, kind of internet in 1988, if you can imagine it. Anyway, it was about 10 o'clock at night. Somebody came up to me, gave me just a massive bunch of keys and says, "You're the last one, lock up." And I thought to myself, wow, this place is very trusting. Anyway, the point I wanted to make to you is I first really encountered power, I think, looking in this delightful environment at annual reports of large companies. And at one level, as designers, we were looking at the photos and the typography and the paper and the print and stuff. But at another level, I was getting the demonstration effect of the gigantic scope of major enterprises. And a friend of mine who should remain nameless, who's spent all his life working at the BBC, actually, he asked me about corporations once. He said, are they corrupt? Are they not corrupt? He'd never worked in a corporation. And I said to him what I still believe to be true, which is anything that's turning over more than about £1 billion or dollars or something is sort of too big to be known. So I'm going to leave it there.
No, well, I'm not going to let you leave it there. You need to expand that.
Well, I think Habermas, the philosopher, has talked about the colonization of the life world. There is a sort of instrumental character to rules-based contract systems that renders them beyond comprehension. I'll give you another example. I think it was probably about maybe 2001 or something. I was at a seminar. It might have been earlier, actually. But BP had just come up with their Beyond Petroleum. And somebody said to me, well, BP say they're beyond petroleum, but do they really mean it? And I remember saying, well, what do you think BP is? Do you think it's the chief executive? Do you think it's the board of directors? Do you think it's the 150,000 employees? Do you think it's the 30,000 petrol stations? Do you think it's the resources in the ground? Do you think it's the money in the bank? Do you think it's the customers? Do you think it's the certificate of incorporation that says the objective of the company is to blah, blah, blah? Broadly speaking, BP is a sort of strange contingent cloud passing through time that we sort of think we know, and I don't think we do. In fact, I've always seen the global business system as like the water, and we're the fish. That famous saying that the fish have no sense of the water? That's what I think business is. It's an almost unknowable supervisory force over most aspects of our existence, and that's power to me.
Okay, and government is similar, would you say?
No, government's very, very different. Right, government has the monopoly on violence, so they can arrest us or kill us if they're that kind of country. But I have a little diagram. At the bottom is what I would call the citizen, and then on top of the citizen is the government. So the government appears to have the monopoly of violence and power. But I would actually say on top of the government is the business system, and so in a sense, lots of politicians have gone into government and sort of said, well, we've got a terrible problem with climate change. We're going to sort of tax and regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And they've discovered they're unable to do so. So, how much power have they really got? It's quite interesting. I've discussed this with a few politicians over the years, and politicians find it very hard to admit they haven't got power. But if you think of the most successful political podcast of our lifetimes, The Rest is Politics with Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, certainly in the first year that they were running this podcast, which everybody listens to, they kept saying, why don't people want to go into politics, and what's wrong with politics? And they seemed mystified. And I'm like, it's not complicated, friends. It's absolutely gigantic amounts of money. And I'm going to use a specific term here. Existing cash flows protect themselves. And this is a very important point. If there's, hundreds of millions or billions in some activity, it will pay to protect itself from law. But if you have some new idea, like, oh, let's have, lots of new low carbon businesses, there's no money to pay for the laws to get those in. So there's money to stop you interfering with existing businesses, but there's no money to get in the laws and policies to help these new, circular economy businesses. And this is what I would call the kind of concretization of our political system, why it's ossified and why it can't really change, and therefore why national governments have much less power than people think.
I love this, and I have a huge amount of sympathy with this way of thinking about power. It reminds me of the military-industrial complex, the military-industrial and academic complex, perhaps, all of that kind of thinking. And I also am, you have navigated this. So I'm curious to know, and part of that is an intellectual conversation like the one we're having now about how it works and how it's ossified and so forth. But I'm assuming you've done, well, I know you've done a lot of things, Paul. As you said, you started CDP and there was just a few of you, and yet you were managing to get politicians to come along. So I'm curious about your practice of power, what you actually do as well. Again, and I want to ask something kind of personal, and only really because I've asked everybody pretty much who's been on this podcast. Did you encounter power as a child? And in some way, has that informed your understanding of power, that the way you're talking about it now, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think I had a a sort of weird psychosomatic problem when I was a child, about 8 or 10 or something. And I think looking back, I was in subconsciously rebelling against power in my school, but I
Mm.
wasn't aware that that's what I was doing.
Uh-huh.
Um, uh, it's going to sound, what I'm about to say is going to sound strange, but various occasions in my life, corporations have tried to kind of steal from me, in a personal capacity, as a consumer, so to say.
Hmm.
And I find that when I'm responding, and by the way, I'm very good at complaining and getting things resolved. I'm
Yeah.
extraordinarily good at that.
Yeah.
But whilst I'm doing that, the sort of hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I feel enormous amounts of adrenaline released into my body.
Uh-huh.
So I do have a visceral response to sort of bullying, particularly by organizations.
Hmm.
Visceral
Hmm.
response.
Hmm. Hmm. Which, I mean, can be read in different ways. I mean, I guess in your case, we could read it as it's driven you and given you all the various things, it's got you through all of these kind of difficult situations, like founding an organization is very hard, isn't it?
Yeah, I also want to share with you one thing that I've certainly been involved with all through my work in any field, but I'm going to give you a little CDP story, which is constant learning. So the particular example I wanted to draw your attention to was, I think it's something like about 2005. CDP had been going about 3 years. And we were contacted by the US Environmental Protection Agency, and they said, could you organize a seminar in the US for companies responding to CDP? We'll give you $25,000. So we thought, okay. So I remember we invited a law firm to sort of offer their offices, which they often do. So I was in New York, and there were 50 people in the room from probably 35, 40 corporations responding to CDP. And like, I was the guy. I was there, saying this and saying that, and you know, advising this and advising that, feeling quite full of myself. And there was a panel that I was chairing later, and somebody said, how do you do greenhouse gas scope 3 reporting? And I was about to speak with my sort of beaming knowledge of everything when some corporation on the panel gave a much better answer than I was going to give. And then I sort of suddenly realized that my job wasn't to know everything,
Uh-huh.
wasn't to know more than the largest companies in the world. What an idiot.
Uh-huh.
My job was to shut up, stay in the basement, and keep the dialogue going amongst the
Uh-huh.
giants.
Uh-huh.
I'm not a giant, right? In fact, I've often said, people from companies will come up to me and they say, oh, congratulations on CDP. And I quote Churchill, I say, you're the lion. We just
Hmm.
give you the roar. And I
Okay.
think the final thing I would say, which is, at one level, and it's going to sound like an odd metaphor, but it's true. The real power of CDP is the power of a kindergarten. We give corporations a place where they can look at climate change, you know, spend some time. They've been asked by their investors, they've been asked by their customers, and they Google it and then they chat amongst themselves, and and then they come to the right answer. The only difference really between the CDP kindergarten and a kindergarten with little 5-year-olds is 5-year-olds are rather resource free, whereas most of the companies responding to us, if they're a bit stuck, they can spend £30 million at McKinsey and get
Hmm.
a very
Hmm.
detailed sense of
Hmm.
what to do. But
Hmm.
there's this phrase in education. I believe the root of the word education is to draw out from.
Hmm.
The reason we've been so successful, the reason why actually the Trump administration right now will not talk about climate change, is because they can't, because the debate was won 10 years ago.
Hmm. Hmm.
So actually, the plan is to stop public debate.
Hmm. Sure. And I know a little bit about CDP. In fact, I remember that basement or one of those basements. Um, but I think for people outside, it's probably still a bit of a mystery. So I wonder if you could unpick it a little bit. And I'm kind of incredibly interested in what you've just described and how you do that, because I think for people outside it will seem somewhat miraculous. There's this guy who's founded this thing, and then he's got a couple of mates along, and they're working in a basement, and somehow or other you attracted all these notable people. You said blithely there. um, we just invited a law firm to give us some offices in New York. I mean, how have you done this, Paul? And that shift you're talking about encouraging other people and facilitating and not being an expert. How have you done it? What's your practice?
Well, I think that, the 11 years I spent in corporate design and corporate communications gave me familiarity with the business system. So I think I probably knew that law firms desperately want corporations to visit their offices. So it wasn't hard,
Okay.
to say, oh, hello, law firm, would you like lots of big companies to come to your offices? It's like, yes, we would. But I mean,
Okay.
I'm gonna go to the really difficult bit. Like, how do you get? So I'm going to take you back to 2001, and the first thing you need to know is that was a long time ago. And the FT would say carbon dioxide emissions, which some people think is linked to the idea of human-induced climate change. That was where the debate was. We recognized, so we went around and spoke to, well, first of all, we got philanthropic money. So we were paid by philanthropists, Ted Turner and various people, to wander around talking to people. And we would go to investors and we'd say, look, would you like some free information? And they would say, well, maybe, maybe not. And we would sort of draft kind of questions. Some excellent people had produced something called the GHG protocol already. So there was a way for corporations to measure their emissions. But we spoke to some investors and sort of say, we don't want any money. Would you allow us to use your name to get some information on climate change, which might be valuable to you? Now, investors do like information. So we were offering investors free information. So that was a good start. It was tricky, though. Climate change was very, very controversial. So I remember in the first ever request for information that we submitted on behalf of some investors, we didn't actually say climate change was real because that was an assertion that was too controversial. But there was something in the UK at that time called the climate change levy, which was a 5% tax on electricity. This is 2001, 2002, business electricity bills. So what we could say is actions in response to the perception of climate change were real, because that tax was real. So we could say, actions in response to the perception of climate change are real. We can get you data on greenhouse gas emissions. Won't cost you anything. We just need your name. And then we spent, it took 2 years to do this, but we managed to get 35 investors. I mean, originally, actually, we managed to get 18 investors, not to say they would sign our information request, but to allow us to say that they were intending to sign our information request. So then we got this list of 18 investors who said that they were intending to sign, and then we went out to a broader group with the documentation and then said, will you sign? And then we just repeated it. And we repeated it year after year. As I said, 22 years doing the same thing. I mean, I don't want to pick on, there was a famous NGO that I did a campaign with. And then after a year, they got bored of it. And I was like, but it's just beginning to go, So the absolutely relentless repetition of the same thing, scaling up and scaling up. So I think I bought some of the absolute myopic dedication of an entrepreneur trying to build a business to an NGO.
Great. Okay. And as you've said, you were kind of leveraging the knowledge you had of the way the industry works and business works and so forth. Is that a particular skill you have, or a particular way of looking as well, would you say?
I think, if you want to talk about kind of epistemology or whatever, one of the things I think that was most valuable to me was starting this small, I worked in a small business with some other people from sort of 1990 through to 1999, so 10 years in a design company that was called Rufus Leonard. It's now been taken over, has a different name. It's a sort of awful cliche. I sound like one of those idiotic US entrepreneurs. I don't want to. But it's kind of like, if we didn't sell, we didn't eat. And so there was really a need. I mean, I'm exaggerating. I come from a reasonably comfortable background. I was never in the slightest danger of starving. But I'm trying to make the point that we had to kind of make it up by succeeding. I mean, I'll tell you a funny little story. In about 1994, I think it was. No, 1995, 96, we'd actually made quite a lot of money in this company for once. And we had a big party and we had like food and drink for 300 people. And I remember at 11 o'clock looking down from the balcony of this design company, and there were 50 people in the room. And I realized that we'd made really quite a lot of money. And so we sort of imagined that we had friends. But because we'd been sitting in our offices for 6 to 7 days a week, working harder than everybody else to win, we were socially and fantastically inept, and we didn't have any friends, So it's just like, but I would say that the heart of what I'm trying to say is there's a kind of knowledge built from experiential engagement with the business system or with the
Mm-hmm.
world, the
Mm-hmm.
kind of kernel of your own understanding, which
Mm-hmm.
is gives you decision-making power in a way that people who've done sort of book learning will never have.
That's great. And then combined with the determination of repetition and so forth, and the deeper drive to kind of achieve something significant, it sounds like.
Yeah,
But
and just one important
go
point,
on.
journalists will say, well, why do you work on climate change? I'm like, well, I can read a graph, and that's really important. I remember, like, I actually had in my little office in Brighton in 1999 the CO2 to temperature, from actually a paper from the Clinton White House. I was stuck on the wall, and I just used to look at
Mm,
it every morning, and I'm like, how many people are going to die?
mm,
Huge,
mm, mm,
huge numbers of people are going to die.
mm,
World War II is 50 million. It's like a walk in the park. I mean, climate
mm,
change is going to kill hundreds of millions, quite possibly billions of people. I mean, there's nothing more important. I can't believe
mm,
everyone is
mm.
running around screaming.
I remember talking to you about that back in that kind of time and getting that passion from you. Okay, this is really helpful. Thank you, and really, really interesting. I mean, the other maybe thing to talk about then is you mentioned the word trust earlier, and then what you've been describing, through your business career and then through this. Another words we could put on that would be selling. Selling has a particular way. I mean, is that what you're doing partly? How do you get
Oh
these
yeah,
luminaries
100%.
involved? And what's your approach to selling? And does it include trust, I guess?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, first of all, I would say that I've always been in sales. In my 10 years in the corporate design industry, I was entirely in sales all that time. I wasn't a
Okay.
designer. I wasn't a project manager. I'm not saying I'm a brilliant salesperson, but I think there are
Well, you
aspects.
must be, Paul. You must
Well,
be at some level. That's what
I,
I'm curious about, how
I
you
think.
do that.
Well, let's talk about that. Just one point I would say is there's really probably different kinds of selling.
Mm,
I think in terms of creating, administrative systems that sell, I'm very good at that. I think
hmm
if I'm sitting with someone who's a budget holder trying to sell the consultancy business I have at the moment, I'm not very good at all. We haven't. I've been trading for about a year, and we've not done that well financially. So I think there's probably different kinds of selling. Maybe I'm better at
hmm
marketing or something like that. But
hmm hmm
I mean, one aspect of selling is this based on trust. When I was selling kind of design services, and I used to have a methodology. So let's imagine you're the client. Let's imagine we've got an hour. I would start off by saying, so Pete, what do you do in your job? And on average, you normally talk for about 30 minutes about that. And then I would say, Pete, what are you trying to do over the next year or two?
hmm
And then typically you would talk for about another 20 minutes. So I've only got 10 minutes left. But then after 50 minutes, I would say, here's how I think we can help you with that.
hmm
And then I would describe our services where they interconnect with what you want to get done.
Yes.
I think what I'm doing there is trusting you that you know your job,
hmm hmm
and then saying how we can help you with it.
mm.
If that's an example of trust, I guess.
Yeah, and no, I think that's absolutely right. And it's digging into needs. I said that the way we're thinking about power is the ability to get goals met or needs met. And what you're doing in that kind of conversation, I assume, is you're exploring that person's needs, and then you're trying to match them up with something that you can offer. And I'm guessing that might be a similar kind of process to what you were describing with CDP. As you said, you get the lawyers have a need to have corporations in their offices, so you facilitated that, and then you did something similar with the very large corporations you were working with.
But
Is
with
that
the
right?
investors, it
Mm,
was we wanted the authority of investors,
mm,
but we got it by saying we'll give you free information.
mm, mm,
We can give you free information. So I think in a way, just if we make it abstract, which I think is the essence of your question, it's like what do you want to get done?
mm,
What does somebody else want to get done? And how can you link them?
quite. And how? What is it that you're doing? If you can kind of interact on that a little bit as well. I mean, what is you're doing that means that people trust you in that process? Because I'm guessing in most of these cases you're just the person they've just met, or.
Well, no, trust is quite a complicated thing, actually, and you do well to mention it. I began working on CDP. I mean, our founder chair, my boss, so to say, was a lady called Tessa Tennant, who very tragically died in 2018 after a long fight with disease. But she had quite a name for herself. She was the first sort of ethical investor. She created a sort of green investment fund in Europe in 1988, actually.
Mm.
And, we sort of had a soft launch of CDP at Downing Street in December 2000 when she was giving a millennial lecture to Tony and Sherry Blair. So it was, we could trade off her credibility. So I didn't have any credibility, but she did. Do you see what I mean?
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so we're constantly building credibility. Do you remember I said those 18 investors who didn't say they'd sign our documentation,
Yes.
but allowed us to tell others that they were intending to sign the documentation?
Yes.
And those were all verbal. They weren't necessarily written confirmations. So no, trust is a very important thing. Little things about trust also. You basically can't lie, because if you lie, you can kind of get caught, and if you get caught, your trust is gone. And I think just simple logic, being clear, making sure other people understand you, make sure you listen. If somebody says, no, you're wrong about that, because you have to listen to them. And if they're right, you have to change your view. So I think, the other part of trust is just adherence to clarity, listening, and logic.
Great, lovely, thank you. And this is again so helpful. I'm really enjoying it. And we seem to be moving a little bit from power now into politics, but politics with a small p, maybe. But maybe we could say a little bit more about how you see. I mean, is that what you're meaning by? Is that a definition of politics that you might concur
Well,
with?
it's funny you mentioned politics with a small p, because I often use the following phrase. I say that the work that we've done on climate change at CDP, a not-for-profit, is very much politics with a small p. There's a general consensus about, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, et cetera, et cetera. Politics with a big P, I always say, is should there be transgender bathrooms in schools in Texas? Or should Xi Jinping have a fourth term as president of China, right? That's politics with a big P. And we in CDP really don't do that. That's nothing to do with us. But politics with a small p is what I would describe as kind of consensus politics. And the word sustainability has been getting a bit of a rap across the knuckles. You can't really say climate change in the US now, because you'll get attacked by some crazy, legal person who, I mean, there's been I call it fossil fuel authoritarianism in the US. We're really at risk of kind of losing democracy in the open society, because the fossil fuel industry and its relatives can't survive in democracy. But where I'm going with this is to say, companies are adopting different sorts of language now. They're talking about efficiency, free energy, and so you're constantly evolving the sort of narrative of politics with a small p, I think. And if you want to sort of get things done in the public interest, you're trying to stay away from that politics with a big P.
Okay, all right. Great. This is again super interesting. So, and when we're talking about politics with a small p, we're talking about the kind of leverage that you gain by not, never tell lies, tell the truth, but amplify or use the resources you have. Like when you've got those people that kind of agree verbally to something, you're using that to gain something else.
Yeah, and let's talk about. Say I was a politician and I wanted very high tax on rich people, or I wanted very low tax on rich people. Lots of debate, lots of different economics professors who will come forward on either side of that debate and give you their best. So essentially, you're in a kind of a world of pain when you're looking for absolute kind of clarity and truth. Whereas if you're saying, I'm a politician and I want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you've basically got a pretty solid consensus from all climate scientists, like, yeah, absolutely, we need to do that. So I think that there's a real difference between generalized politics and what I would call science-based policy. And I think that phrase science-based policy is quite a valuable phrase. Now, if the new US Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, who used to run a fracking company, was on this call, he'd say science-based policy should be to ignore greenhouse gas emissions and focus on providing energy for the poorest people in the world. There are millions of people dying because they're breathing in smoke from cook stoves, and if they had gas to burn, their lives would be improved. And he's sort of got a point. But the critical issue is that he's trying to confuse development objectives with greenhouse gas emissions, ignoring greenhouse gas emissions. I think that the reason that we at CDP, for example, and in other work I've done on climate change, are able to exercise so much power is because of the clarity of the scientific consensus. And just also to add, people sort of say, did you know CDP would be successful? And I always say, look, I didn't know if CDP would be successful because I was perfectly capable, and me and my colleagues, we could have messed it up. But I did know extreme weather would start to become more and more apparent, and that would galvanize public opinion ever more towards believing that we need to do something about climate change. So, again, whatever political authority we had from extreme weather in 2001, we have massively more in 2025.
So the context has been shifting all that time. Can you say a little bit more about language, though? I mean, because you were talking about how the language might be being captured or something. What effect? I mean, bringing it right up to date as well would be interesting. What do you think's going on with language in the sphere?
Well, it's I mean, I'm actually pitching, or a client, a financial institution has actually pitched a question about sustainability. It's a terrible word. It's a terrible word. Once somebody who was involved in circular economy was giving a lecture, and I heard them say, "How sustainable is your marriage?" It's not a nice question. Like, what do you? Yeah,
yeah.
So I think that, and also I have a definition for sustainability, which I am rock solid. This is what sustainability means. If anyone is in any doubt, it is the name we give to problems the government doesn't seem to be able to fix. Right? COVID-19. That's not sustainability. Or invasion of Ukraine, that's not sustainability. Or if aliens attack Earth, the military will fire missiles at them, that's not sustainability. But when you look through government, like, it's not even there. Oh, sustainability, So, but we haven't found the words really to describe it. Action on climate change, everyone knows that, you reduce your own emissions a small amount or a large amount even. You can kind of never fly and, insulate your house and eat vegan, and, the percentage reduction in global climate change is obviously, super small. But, almost never has a by-election ever been won by one vote, right? But everybody still goes out and votes. So, yeah, I mean, we are, I think, constantly seeking the language of, that we need to get things done. And actually, as part of my research for this project, I drew on statements from the chief executive of Microsoft, Nadella, Satya Nadella, I think his name is. He'd been in the role 50 days in 2014, and he issued a press release and also told all the staff at Microsoft, we're going to be mobile first, cloud first. And since he said that, the stock price of Microsoft over the following 10 years has gone up 6 times. It's a $3 trillion company. So there is that, you can unleash tremendous outcomes with the right language.
Okay, all right, lovely, thank you. And it's all shifting at the moment in American politics and all of that, and global politics.
There is an attempted coup by the fossil fuel industry. And just to be clear about this, there's no money in DEI. Get rid of DEI, no one makes any money. You can attack transgender people, nobody makes any money. You can deport illegal immigrants, nobody makes any money. And then you can say drill, baby, drill, and a whole bunch of industries that are suffering an existential crisis from renewable energy and electric vehicles get a stay of execution. So yeah, this is an attempted coup in the United States by the fossil fuel and related industries. And when it collapses, we have to make sure that power never again comes to threaten our democracies.
Fantastic. Great. Okay. We need to probably wrap up. This has been fascinating, Paul. I just wanted to give you the opportunity to add anything else that we might have skipped over or that's coming up for you.
I would like to add a last thing. Well, first, a big thank you to you, Pete. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I would like to make a last comment, but I'd like to make it in response to what you are looking for with this podcast series. Just tell me in one sentence, what are you looking for?
Well, maybe it's to do with language, spreading very simply, if those words healthy power went out a little bit further, we'd be quite happy with that. I'd be happy with that.
All right. So I would, my answer, and the last thing I'd like to say is I would invite you and listeners, I guess, to focus on the word healthy. I think power is easy. Healthy
Uh-huh.
is considerably more complex. But it's a good metaphor. You know, people have talked about human flourishing, and there have been other attempts to sort of find the kind of the mother concept behind a safe and happy society. Healthy is good. In fact, in lots of conversations on climate change, people have found nexuses between health and these problems.
Mm.
So I think you're really onto something. And who wouldn't want a healthy society? Certainly, we both do.
All right, great. Thank you. That's a lovely way to finish. Thank you ever so much. For the rest of you out there, yeah, for the listeners, thank you so much for listening when you do. And I will publish some more episodes shortly. But Paul, thank you again. It's been great having you along.
Great to be with you, Pete. Thank you.